Our second scripture today is from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 9, verses 28 to 36. Now, about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. While he was praying, the appearance of his face changed. His clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now, Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but since they had stayed awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it's good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he had said. And while he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone. And they kept silent in those days, told no one of any of the things they had seen. This is one of the strangest passages in the New Testament. And it comes up every year in the lectionary. Because the last Sunday before Lent begins, is called Transfiguration Sunday. This is the passage, and it comes up every year. And every year I read it, and every year I think, sweet Lord, why in the world is this here? What am I going to talk about with this? It's just weird. It's just weird. Here, Jesus and 3 of his disciples have gone to the mountain, and they've gone up there, and Jesus is praying. And it's kind of funny, this is the one time they stayed awake. And this strange thing happens. Suddenly, Jesus is different. He's got this glow surrounding him. His clothes have turned white, and this glow is emanating from him, and it's reminiscent of the story of Moses that Paula read earlier. You know, that story that Moses goes and he speaks with God, and he comes down, and his face is shining so that people are terrified of what's going on. It's reminiscent of that. And then, as Jesus is glowing, suddenly Moses and Elijah appear in the light, talking with Jesus. This is obviously a transcendent experience. This is obviously something holy is going on here. God is present in a way that is not commonly experienced. And we read it, I read it every year, and I think, what in the world does this mean? What was it that Luke saw in this story that was so important that he put it in his gospel? That he wanted his church to read this and learn something. What did he want them to know? And beyond that, what in the world are we supposed to do with this weird passage? This weird passage. Scholars have argued about it since the beginning. Some have focused on the 3 disciples, some have focused on Jesus, still others on the significance of Moses and Elijah, others about the light and what it means. Some have taken the easy way out and just looked at the details and kind of explained them. Well, the booths talk back to the festival of booths, and the glow, that has to do with Moses' encounter with God on the mountain, and Elijah represent the law and the prophets, and they go on like that, and you still are left with that question, okay, fine, now what? What in the world do we do with this? What did Luke want his audience to know, and what does it say for us? In the verses just prior to the reading today, Jesus has told his disciples that he's headed to Jerusalem, where he will be rejected, humiliated, and killed. They were not the words the disciples wanted to hear. That wasn't the reason they had decided to go to Jerusalem. They were expecting this was going to be a triumphant entry when God's kingdom would come in its fullness, and they were ready. They had given up everything to follow Jesus. They had chosen to throw their lots in with this teacher whom they believed would change everything. This teacher whom they believed would be the one who would create this new world order based on God's yearnings. They were ready. They thought this was the moment it was all going to fall in place. This is why they were here, why they were following Jesus. And then he tells them, well, actually, I'm going to die. And it sounded to them as if what he was saying was everything that they had done was for naught. It was all futile. Their dreams and hopes would hang on a cross rather than sit on a throne. They were searching for hope and possibilities, and he offered nothing but despair. They were understandably upset with Jesus. They were concerned about the validity of all of this thing. You know the story. Jesus tells them that, and Peter pulls them apart and says, Jesus, this ain't going to happen. We won't let it happen. You think they're going to kill you? You watch. And of course, Jesus says, Peter, you don't get it. Not only am I going to suffer, you too. Boy, that's an encouraging word, isn't it? I mean, just the kind of thing that you expect someone doing evangelism to say. Don't you want to follow Jesus? Right to the cross. Suddenly, everything looked different to them than they had expected. Their dreams were upside down. Their future was thrown into a tizzy. And I can imagine them grumbling to each other, depressed, angry, sitting there and recounting everything that they had given up. Friends and family and jobs and prized possessions, their places in the community, and now for nothing. Their faith was dwindling away, and if we read that passage, you notice that it doesn't tell us anything that happened in 8 days. 8 days. Luke is silent. Maybe Jesus was silent for 8 days. Maybe for 8 days, all they did was stew in that bad news. Maybe for 8 days, all they did was grumble to each other, spiraling downward with their despair growing. And then today's passage. Jesus goes up the mountain to pray. 3 of the disciples follow him, and this weird thing happens. And I think what's going on with Peter here is he's finally had enough. You know, he sees this weird experience. It's obvious to him that God is here, and Moses and Elijah are talking with Jesus about what's going to happen in Jerusalem, and it's all just too much for Peter. Peter never had any gates. So as soon as Moses and Elijah disappear, Peter goes up and says, it's a good thing we were here, Jesus, because we can build 3 booths for you, 3 dwelling places, 3 buildings, one to hold you, one to hold Moses, and one to hold Elijah. Their dreams had been dashed, and then this weird, terrifying, holy experience, and Peter says, let's build something. Now, lots of cultures do that. They build things where they've had a holy experience. If you go through Celtic lands, you see these wonderful stone circles. And they feel holy. And we've all had those, maybe we haven't all had those, but many of us have had those experiences where we've visited the old ruins of an old church or an old abbey or something like that, and you walk in and it feels like you're standing on holy ground. You know, this place was built here because this is a thin place. One of those places where it's really, really easy to experience the presence of God. The early Israelites built stone altars wherever they had experienced God's presence. Other cultures do it as well. And we tend, when we look at those things, to experience them as if they are memorials to the experience. They put Stonehenge there because that was a place where they tasted the divine. The Israelites built a stone altar here because they had encountered God in that place. And they wanted to remember it and memorialize it. And that's partly true. But it's only partly true. The other purpose of those things was as warning signs. You don't want to get too close to here. Because this is a place that is really thin. And if you show up here, you might just encounter God. And that is not a pleasant experience always. Get too close, who knows what might happen next. And so in a very real sense, those structures became ways of trying to contain the divine. If we don't get too close to it, God can't change things. We can stop God by building this structure here. Remember back again to the passage that Paula read. Moses comes down from experiencing God and his face is glowing, and they want to see his face glowing, and he talks to them because that reassures them that yes, indeed, he really did talk with God. But as soon as that's over, cover it with a veil so that we don't have to confront the fact that God is here. We can put up this barrier. We can contain the experience of the holy. And we don't do that in quite the same way any longer, do we? We don't have a holy experience off in the woods and put up a stone circle. We'd get in trouble if we did that. But we try to contain God in other ways. We write, in the more connectional church, we write creeds. This is what it means to be a follower of Jesus. We put it in 3 paragraphs, and that's all you need. Now, we Baptists, we said, no, we're going to write statements of faith. They don't have quite the same import as a creed, but in many ways they function the same way. This is what we believe. Boom! Don't you dare try and go outside that. Sometimes we do it in our liturgies. You know? If you had come to the church, I was behind this week because of being out of town, but if you'd come to the church on Friday afternoon, you could have picked up the bulletin and you would have known what we were going to sing and what was going to happen, and you would have known what I was going to preach on. And most weeks, if you come to Bible study, you get a sense of what I'm going to talk about and how I'm beginning to wrestle with the passage, and it was all planned. And if someone says, aren't you open to the moving of the Spirit? And my answer is always something like, well, if the Spirit can't move on Tuesday, the Spirit's not going to move on Sunday. Sometimes in books or documents that define how a church or a denomination is to behave and is structured. Now, it's kind of funny, we as Baptists, you go to one of the big Baptist meetings, and sitting up on the front platform during all the business meetings is a parliamentarian with Robert's Rules in his hand. God works by Robert's Rules. Didn't you know that? This past week was a blatant and obvious example of all of that in the United Methodist Church. Their central book is called the Book of Discipline, and it's got some theological stuff in it, but it's also got some structural stuff. This is how the Methodists do things. And in the 1970s, they added a statement to the Book of Discipline. It hadn't been there before that said, we believe that the practice of homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching, or something to that effect. Well, since they put that in there, there's been a lot of cultural change, there's been a lot of theological change, and there are a lot of Christians who say, well, we don't really believe that. And most denominations have struggled with it. We Baptists, we fought those battles in the 1980s and 1990s. I've got my scars. And in large degree, where the Baptists came out was we said, you know what, we're Baptists, we can't tell you what you're supposed to believe about these things. You got to figure that out for yourself, between yourself and God, and there you go. And so there's been room, at least in the American Baptists, which is what we are, to have diversity of views. And the Methodists didn't have that, because that's not how Methodists work. They've got a book of discipline, and it says this, and this is what it means to be a Methodist, and they've been fighting about it for all this time, and they put together a commission 3 years ago that was to wrestle with the question and come back with a recommendation that they would vote on and include in the book of discipline. And they had 3 options that came. The first option was called the simple plan. We're just going to remove that statement and ignore it. The second option was kind of like a Baptist option. They said, and it was the one church plan, and it was going to say, we have diversity of views on this, and we're going to leave room for that so that individual churches and individual districts, which is their regional kind of gathering, can make their own decisions, and we're going to allow that. So a church wants to do LGBTQIA weddings, they can do that. If they don't have to. If you want to, or if a district wants to ordain a gay pastor, they can do that. If this district says no, they can say no, and we're going to let that go. That was option 2. Option 3 was called the traditional plan. And they were going to hold that statement that was currently in there, but they were going to double down. And they were going to say, yes, indeed, we believe, United Methodists, that the practice of homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. Therefore, if a clergy person does a gay wedding, they will be suspended without pay for a year. The first time. Second time, they will be defrocked. Done, gone, forever. Churches will be penalized if they act in those ways. And in the Methodist system, they can move leaders around. So if you're doing the wrong thing, we're going to correct you by sending in a proper pastor with the right theology. And that was what voted through. That was what they voted through. Now, the irony in all of this is for the past number of years, the motto of United Methodists has been open hearts, open minds, open doors. And they essentially changed it at the meeting to closed hearts, closed minds, closed doors. Because they essentially said, there's no room for any discussion. We don't want to hear what you have to say about it. We don't care what God has to say about it. This is where we are. And even God can't move us from this place. We had a Sunday school class here some years back where we wrote statements of faith. And little small groups that wrote statements of faith. Good Baptist thing. And my favorite one was a group that was led by Steve Rudy. And the first line in that little group's statement of faith was, I love this. I'm going to get this tattooed on my arm. All statements of faith, this is really the irony of having it tattooed. All statements of faith must be written in pencil. And when he read that, I thought, that's it. That's it. Because it removes that hubris that says, we know what God wants. And it says, you know what? We're going to be humble here because God has new things to say to us. And even if God only has old things to say to us, we haven't listened very well all the time. So there's always room for growth. There's always room for change. So you better have an eraser. Because whatever you want to say, you don't have the whole story. That is so traditionally Baptist. I just loved it. Peter has this experience of the divine, and the first thing he wants to do is build a building. He wants to put walls around it to keep it in place. Because if you let God free, who knows what God might do? And God responds. Peter, this is my son. This is my chosen. Listen to him. You can't build any walls, Peter. You can't keep God in. There was no way to contain God then. There's no way to contain God now. God will continue to speak. Another denomination that had a wonderful motto that I really like was the UCC Church. And they said, don't ever put a period where God puts a comma. And our call is to keep open hearts. Because God is going to challenge us to welcome, to love, to embrace folk that we haven't loved, welcomed, or embraced in the past. Open minds, because God is going to push us to places we didn't expect to be. But where God has yearned for us to be all along. And to open the doors of our buildings and our hearts. Now, we can build structures, whether they be physical ones, theological ones, political ones, to try to contain God. But the end result of all of those is not that we contain God. It ends up that we've just contained ourselves. And usually, God is on the other side. And so we find ourselves cut off from the wonders, from the possibilities, from the miracles that God has for us, if only we keep open hearts, open minds, and open doors. It's a weird passage, but I think that's what it has to say to us today.